Hello and welcome to Alta Asks Live. Thank you so much for joining us for what is kind of incredibly episode 36 of this author and Alta contributor interview series. That's a lot of words. I'm Beth Spotswood. I'm Alta's digital editor. And today I am so excited to welcome a longtime Alta supporter and contributor. She is a journalist and an author, Lynell George. Lynell will be in conversation with Alta Books editor David L. Ulin today to discuss her extraordinary new book, A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky, The World of Octavia E. Butler. We are open to your questions, and I hope that you'll use the chat feature or the question button directly below me to ask anything you'd like Lynell to answer. David and Lynell are going to chat for about 20-25 minutes. I will loop back at the end and we'll get to as many of your questions as possible. There is a link to A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky directly below the video right now if you want to go to bookshop.org and check that out. And I would be remiss if I didn't grab this opportunity before we begin with Lynell to let you know that tomorrow we have our last event of the year. It is the California Book Club's interview with Walter Mosley, author of Devil in a Blue Dress. So I'll give you all the deets to that in the comments as soon as we get started. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my friends David and Lynell. Take it away, guys.
Thanks, Beth. Hi, Lynell.
Hello. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Looking forward to our talk. This book is beautiful. I think let's just start with that. This book it's a beautiful book as object, but also the kind of language and the thinking and the sort of the conversation that goes on this book is gorgeous. So I just want to preface that because it feels like it doesn't, we don't say that stuff that much. So I want to start just by talking a little bit about how you came to this project. Then we can move into some other territories. I want to talk a bit about Butler, obviously, and also how this connects with your long body of work. But how did you first get involved in Butler, and how did that lead to this book?
Okay, I'm going to try to make this the shortest version of the story. But in late 2015, early 2016, I got an email from Julia Meltzer, who is the executive director and founder of Clock Shop, an arts organization based in Los Angeles. And Julia had an idea that she wanted to put a group of writers and artists together in the archive, the Butler Archive, which was at the Huntington, and wanted us to go in and create a piece based on what we found. And so she just gave me really broad parameters. I'm going to commission this piece, posthumous interview. And I thought, okay, I don't know what that's going to look like. Mm-hmm. But okay, of course I want to go into the archive. I want to, be in her world. So that's how I got to the archive. I put together the piece for Julia, but while I was working on that piece, I could see that there were other things there, and there were other things that were speaking to me and questioning. And it began
other things in the archive, other elements, other pieces in the collection.
Right, other pieces in the collection. Because what I started to do for the interview, I was looking specifically at her personal papers, not drafts of the manuscripts. I didn't want formal Butler. I wanted vulnerable Butler. I wanted intimate Butler. So I was looking at journals and her commonplace books and letters. And then that took me to marginalia. And in that, she's interrogating herself. She's asking questions and answering them over periods of time. So that's how I put the interview together. But in looking at those pieces, those notebooks, where she would write, she'd turn an envelope over and start writing dialogue, or she would make a sketch of something. And I realized, wait a second, these are the things she touches every day. What are the things she uses every day? What does a writer need? And that's where this started to take shape, this idea. It was very, very, at first, very abstract idea. But then I started to home in on it.
What was the most surprising thing you found in the archive?
That's such a tough question. I think the most surprising thing, because there's so much, it's huge. It's almost 400 boxes. And so I think it wasn't so much an object itself as the person I found in the archive and the layered personality. I always talk about with friends who have been through this journey with me, is that, you see Octavia and, she has, such a formal, she presented herself in such a formal way and this very serious countenance, but she had a sense of humor. And also, I think the other thing about, and that's what you see in their archive, just her, like engaging with the work or engaging with her day. And that pulled her through, her sense of humor about the world around her. It's very grim stuff she's dealing with, climate change and destruction and, people like, cannibalizing one another. It's very, like dark, but she had a sense of humor. The other piece though, that was interesting to me is the magic she made with time. For someone who had very, very little time, when you think about, there was a period she was working full-time and part-time and going to school and finding time to write. And the way she bent time was fascinating to me. She just found little tiny crevices of things and she could go deep and work and get things done. And I learned something from that too. So that was surprising as well, that you can have a very full day, very full life, and still give your full self to your craft.
Right. I want to go back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about the intimate butler, right? Not the formal butler, but the kind of vulnerable butler.
Yes.
She basically saved everything, right? The 100 boxes are, it's lists, it's notebooks, it's scrap paper, it's all of it. So I'm curious. We tend to think sometimes that for a researcher, that's heaven, right? That you've got all this material, so there's all these possibilities, but that also can be quite daunting. So I'm curious about kind of that process of finding that intimate butler, or also maybe even differently, that process of not being overwhelmed by that intimate butler, given how much material there was that you were looking at.
Yes. In the beginning, I'll be quite honest, I was very overwhelmed, and I'm somebody that loves research and I love to just dig in. And as a reporter, our version of it too is access, so I had both things. I had the research materials and I also had access to Butler, and not just, looking across the table from her and sitting and interviewing her, but it was inside her head and inside her heart. So there was that too. So, in a way, joy, yay, but so much. And it really was, I had to kind of, in the beginning, trust my own instincts and trust the archive and know that she was going to eventually reveal herself to me. But in the beginning, I was really worried because, of course, for the initial piece, I was staring at a deadline. But once I broke through, and that took a couple of weeks of just thinking, okay, follow your gut. And once I got into the journals and the diaries in particular, then I started to hear her, and her voice changes over time. As a child, she started, journaling, when she was 10, 11. So we watch her grow into the famous author through her diaries. So once I got to know those different voices and then deciphering the cramped cursive, because some days I would spend and my eyes would be, I'd be this, trying to make out her cursive, but knowing, and then I could tell I was in a good place because I knew the difference between a day that was bad and a day that was good based on her handwriting. So things like that happened, So to answer your question, it was both. It was both at first overwhelming, daunting, and I wondered, I'll need more time. I'll need more time. And then no, once I understood her, and this isn't to say that I looked at everything, but I could make better decisions. Like, say I would get to the edge of a cliff of a thought, or she was working on something and then the next page she would be on to something else. I started to know she may have continued that thought in this book, So I would pull that box. So I could now start to kind of like, climb, over and find things based on the way she would organize things.
One of the most remarkable things about this book is the way that the voice works. I know we talked about this a little bit in our email exchange, but the voice that you found for the book, that kind of the conversational quality of the book. I've never quite read a piece of, criticism or literary biography like this, where it is so much about the conversation between author and subject. Is that something that began to develop through this process you're talking about kind of starting to really be able to intuit where a particular line of thought that might get dropped in one document was picked up in another, and how did that develop, that voice?
Oh, that was the toughest thing about this whole project, was trying to figure out how I was going to merge both of us, because I knew that she was going to be central focus of the book. It had to be her, but I was going to have to be the person that's going to move her through time and space. And I really did wrestle with trying to figure out like what I was going to do. And we are very different writers. Her voice is very different from my voice. And I did read, right before I went into this, I started to read her essays, because I kind of wanted to, in her short stories, because I wanted to see, well, what is she when she's more pared down, and to see if there was a way to build a bridge. So I wanted to see that formal voice, but then I went back to the personal. And in the end, I had amassed so much. If you could see, I have this huge tote bag that I'm not going to get up to get, but it's huge, of all the materials I've collected, and the transcriptions I made inside the library, and the decisions I had to make in grouping. And I have my own organizing, my grids that I created. And then I thought, I have to put all of that away, because I'm now feeling burdened by my responsibilities, and I cannot be free enough to write. And I have to be able to, for want of a better word, channel her. So I did what I do when I have spent a long time reporting a story, a year or so, following somebody, put everything away. And I just started writing her, and first in her voice, and trying to mimic that. I started with the child's voice in the beginning, and imagining her, standing on a blacktop, or standing at a bus stop, or standing here. And what is she looking at? And what is she feeling? And what does Pasadena mean to her? And then once I started doing that, and I started to do that every day, just start writing as her, then I could get into the mindset, and then I could figure out how to have a conversation with that little girl. And then later, as she got older, the woman she became.
Let's talk a little bit about her. I mean, what was your? I know you talk in the book about having seen her, or about you knew her, you didn't know her, but you saw her read. You kind of were aware of her while she was living. I remember seeing her once read, and going back to what you're saying about her kind of seriousness, I found her so kind of imposing and kind of almost intimidating as a figure in some way. Also, she was such a genius writer. But what was your, as a reader before you came to this project, what was your sense of her?
My mother was the Butler fan, and my mom was an English teacher. She taught junior high school and also high school English. And she always, books were really important to have in our home, because she was supplementing reading. And so that she knew I wouldn't get in school. So I was introduced to Butler that way. But I used to watch my mom, she would have a student that was, having a tough time, didn't think that they were a reader, and she would hand them books. So she would always have extra books. And Butler was one of the people she would hand to students who felt like, these books aren't speaking to me. So Kindred was the first book I read of Butler's, and I cannot remember the year. It had been out probably for a while, but that was the one that hooked me. I've always been into books that are, either time travel, tricks of time, people sliding back and forth. And, there's like one of my favorite childhood books is called Charlotte Sometimes, and it's also the same kind of thing, like, slipping through, this portal of time. And that book though got me because it was history too. And it was speaking to a history that we were still living in ways about, the hierarchies of race and who has power. And But yet it was also set in Southern California, it was before I lived in Pasadena, but yeah, there's scenes at the Rose Bowl and, like, oh, okay, this is here and now, and then of course, going back to Maryland, in the antebellum South, but it just really caught my attention. Like no one was doing something like this about that subject matter.
Yeah, I mean, I was blown away by that the same way. It was so vivid and so present, almost present tensey. Like, the stuff that, like, yeah, as you say, the Rose Bowl, or just the distance between Los Angeles and Pasadena, but yet it was set in this, it was also addressing, all of those works were addressing kind of contemporary concerns, but through that sort of futuristic, often apocalyptic kind of lens or landscape.
Exactly.
And I hadn't seen that. Either. Were you? So it's a combination of sort of the draw of her as a science fiction writer, and also of her as kind of being deeply rooted in Southern California as a writer. Yeah, absolutely.
And being able to be up close to her, this idea of like, my mom taking me to a reading, and she's inches away from me, and she spoke to me afterward, and I was, at this point, like, I was writing. I wasn't calling myself a writer, but I was writing, for myself, writing little short stories and things for myself. But there's something really powerful, and you cannot minimize that to see. And I think about this all the time when I think about someone like Octavia or a Wanda Coleman. To see, these people walk through a door with their purse on their shoulder, and they're arriving, and they're putting on they're people, and then they get up there and they are authors, and that's something to aspire, to.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's actually, the comparison to Wanda is a great one, because I think of them both as kind of people who, when they got in front of, they kind of embodied themselves in a way, in front of an audience,
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what do you think at this point? I mean, now we are kind of, we're 14 years past her death. I don't want to say that she's was underrated or under-recognized in her own time. She was the first science fiction writer ever to win a MacArthur, but she was also, I felt, always kind of, I don't know, marginalized, or not exactly marginalized, but she was, there weren't a lot of, or the perception was that there weren't a lot of Black science fiction writers. So she was always kind of regarded as slightly anomalous, even though she was honored for her genius. I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
I think there's some really poignant notations in the archive that occur after, exactly this, after she's won the MacArthur, after she's been published for years, where she's saying, if I write, God is change over and over, will anyone hear me? You always feel like, and it's like with everything, what writers do, it's like, you're done with this one and you're on to the next one. And the other real fear, and it's the way I wanted to, not to, take away too much from the end of the book. So I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to talk about this without giving away the end. But, as she becomes older, she realizes the other thing that happens to Black people and Black women in particular, she didn't want to be pigeonholed either. So she was like, yeah, I'm a Black woman who writes science fiction. Absolutely. And this is absolutely one of the most important things about me. But I do not want to be, as she called, a dancing bear. It's not that I'm not it's like, this isn't a, sideshow for you to come and watch. I have things I want to say, and they are very important. And there are things, that she wanted to do that she didn't want to be thought of as this novelty. She really, really, really worked at trying to break through that. And that was up until the end too.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I'm curious about about her journey and your investigation, or your sort of, immersion, I guess, into her life, connects in your mind with your previous books, because it feels to me like it's definitely a turn of some sort, but it feels, but A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky feels very consistent with After Image and No Crystal Stair, just in terms of that sense of, partly sort of Black life in Southern California, but also some of what you're talking about, right? there, about being seen as opposed to being, as opposed to being represented, or not being a dancing bear. So I'm curious about that kind of through line of those three books.
I am so interested in the Great Migration stories. I'm obviously a product of the Great Migration. I've written about it, I'm writing about it again. And Butler's family was part of that. They also came from Louisiana. And this idea of being able to come to this place to achieve your dreams and to dream big. But that's one of the things I really wanted to start with, is like the family moved physically to this paradise and to imagine a different life. And Octavia was unhappy. She spent a lot of her time as a youth being extremely unhappy because she saw what the limitations were as a young Black girl and how people saw her and treated her. And her mother would warn her. Her mother, she said, was Louisiana cautious. Her mother would warn her and say, now be careful about doing that. And you can't just walk into those stores there, and you need to be careful. Those white people don't necessarily want you there. And so she wanted her to prepare herself for life, but Octavia wanted more. And so her migration was of the mind and moving beyond boundaries that way. And she used her imagination. So yes, so that's the extension. It's like you can dream. She wanted to dream beyond what she could see. And that is the through line, with, I think, all three of these books.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of in the review that Nyela Orr did of the book for Alta, she cites that this interview where Butler talks about as a young girl playing with the dog in a house where her mother was the housekeeper, and recognizing that there was an intelligence, and like looking into the dog's eyes and recognizing that there was an intelligence, and that was the first moment of kind of understanding connection to the other in some way on her own personal level, and led to a lot of things. And I think about that as a kind of signature moment in some way in her life, that kind of exactly what you're saying, kind of moving into the realm of the imagination.
Right. Exactly. And she just, I think this idea too of like, picking science fiction, she picked science fiction because, as she said, I started writing, to create a space for myself.
Yeah.
And not even, she said, I made myself the star of my stories. And I think, there's so many Black writers that did that anyway. I was writing fiction and I was doing that. And even in journalism, part of it is to create space and write about things that are not seen and are muted, and, to fill in the picture. And, it was a way to take your freedom, to take space, to fill it in, to make it more vivid.
And to assert your voice,
Exactly.
And I think that's a key fact. Like, she could not take for granted the fact that she could assert her voice.
Absolutely. And for someone who was so cripplingly shy, and she was, and introverted, the fact that she did what she did is amazing. And you see that in the archive. Is like, she struggles in her journals to, like, she berates herself. Why did you say that? Do not speak until you know exactly what you're going to say. You don't have room to make mistakes. And I would just like feeling it here in my chest, because she's being so hard on herself. I understand why, but she's being so hard on herself. But she was able to create this person who could be out in the world eventually. She forced herself to like just drop all of that and go out and make mistakes and say the wrong thing. And then she would just try again and try again and try again until it looked like it was second nature.
And the other thing I'm struck by, we're going to come to questions from all of you in about a minute, but the other thing I'm struck by is that sense of real profound self-creation. I mean, I don't know what else to call them. Affirmations seems to reduce them, but those kind of affirmations sort of imagined herself as this famous writer, years before it ever happened. There's something so powerful about watching her literally imagine herself into being. And
I love the details, and again, these are things like, there's so much I wanted to include, like, maybe there'll be a part 2, part 3, but she would imagine down to what her house should look like, what her office would look like, what would be on the bookshelves, what would be in the office. She visualized everything. everything. That was all part of like her being in the space that she wanted to be in her life, you know. So it really was, and it was daily. It was daily, that sort of attention to her spirit,
yeah,
and her dream.
No, that's, I mean, to me, some of the most remarkable and inspirational, or one of the most remarkable and inspirational things about her as a human, separate from her as a writer. I just, one last question for me, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. Do you think that her legacy has changed in the years since she died? I mean, do you think, what would you say her legacy is now? And is that different from what you might have said if I'd asked you this question in 2006 or 2007?
I don't know if it's changed as much as we've caught up to her.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's more that. And, you know, she always said, you know, that she, you know, everyone's like, oh, you're so prescient. You're so prescient. And she would say, no, you know, I'm just paying attention. And now it's like, okay, Octavia was right. Octavia tried to tell us, you know, and we didn't listen to her not because she wanted to scare us, but she wanted us to be prepared, you know, for the things we're experiencing now, you know, the crazy government, the chaos, you know, of climate, all of it. She wanted us to be ready and mindful and figure out a plan and take up our responsibilities.
Yes. I mean, I think of that story. I'm so terrible with titles. I'm kind of trying to look it up while we're talking, but I'm failing. But that short story about the bus, you know, the post-pandemic bus trip from Los Angeles to Pasadena.
Yes.
And, you know, reading that story this year was just like
speech sounds.
Yes, speech sounds. Reading that story this year, I'd read it before, but reading it this year was like my heart was stopping as I was reading it. You know, in terms of that.
And you can tell from the journals that, and she used to carry these tiny little memo books around. There were constantly fights on the buses. And I thought that happened on a bus. Some of those scenes, I'm sure it was something she saw that triggered, you know, her to like, okay, that's going to be part of what this is.
Yeah, it's remarkable. Thank you so much. It's been a great conversation. We could go on for longer, but let's bring in some questions from the folks out there. Bring Beth back. Hi, Beth.
Hi. Lynell, can you think of any authors in the vein of Octavia Butler that we should know about that we might not have heard of?
Oh gosh, these questions are really hard for me because I just feel like I can't answer that because she was so many different things. You know, she wasn't just science fiction and she wasn't just fantasy. And I always feel like, and then there are people who are writing around the edges of what she does, but wouldn't put themselves in her category either. So that's why I always feel like that's a dangerous question to ask. I really do think she was really singular in what she's doing, you know, like what she was doing. Yes, what she did do, and I can say this, she definitely opened the door for a new generation of people to come through. And the most beautiful thing about all of this is that for someone who so wanted a community and who was so isolated, you know, and talked about her isolation and wanting community and trying to figure out how she could create it, there's a community around her, you know. So there was something really beautiful, like when I saw her speak the last time I saw her in person, which was at the Black to the Future conference in Seattle. And it was fascinating. And for her to sit and look around this room and see filmmakers, visual artists, writers, musicians, African, and most were Black, you know, they were African American and from other places, you know, the diaspora. And for her to look around the room and see that, I know she was moved. And she is just, you know, she just triggered this tidal wave of people, of creativity.
Have you been to the Los Angeles Public Library room dedicated to her?
Yes. And I want to go make something. I haven't had a chance to go because COVID, but I went in there and I was very emotional because I thought this was her palace. And to know that they've created this space for her, named after her, for people to create things, all kinds of things. You know, they were making face masks for frontline workers at the beginning of the pandemic, you know, and they were coming out of the Octavia lab. And, you know, it's everything 3D printing, there's sewing machines, there's, you know, computers for filmmaking, you know, you can do, you know, make digital copies of photographs. I said, I really do want to go down and make something there, you know, but time hasn't been on our side with COVID.
Mary in LA wants to know, the scrapbooking aspect of the book is so engrossing. Is the archivist in you looking at your own history differently now?
Wow. Really, really, really good question. Yes. And it's going to be a weird response in that, like, it's really made me think about, like, what do I need to keep and what do I need to destroy? You know? And only because, you know, I don't know if she had time, you know, if she hadn't died so suddenly at 58, you know, would all of this had been there, and we benefited from that. And I am grateful that she just didn't edit it. She just let it go, you know, as it was. But you know, even if I was spending a year with her, a year and a half, 2 years, there's some things in that archive when you are having a really down period. I don't know. Did she want everyone to know that? You know, I'm not sure. She picked herself up. She went on. But there were some days, you know, I'd be in the archive and I would tear up, and because, like, this is bad. You know, the check didn't come. It did not seem like things were going to turn themselves around. And I had the gift of future vision. And I know it's going to be better in a year or 2 years. It's going to be hard, though. How is she going to do this to get through it? And so there is something about that, like, you know, the gift we get of that is that your lowest low does not have to mean that you will stay there. Because look what she accomplished. So to answer Mary's question, yes, I've been thinking a lot about, you know, I don't journal like she did, but I have bits and pieces of all kinds of things that I save, and I'm trying to decide what I should keep and what would matter and what would tell the story of my own life or my own process. It really has occurred to me, like, I've got to convert, you know, tapes of interviews that I've done, you know, with figures. Some are gone, you know, the people. I need to have those digitally saved, you know, because those are pieces of history that will be gone if I don't take care of it. So yeah, so I have been starting to think differently about what is part of my archive as a journalist, as well as an essayist.
And hanging on to it all, I hope.
Yes, right now I haven't destroyed anything.
A very special episode
out there. I know, like, a couple of people that have tuned in who were asking me that, you know, a while ago, like, don't throw anything away.
Parable of the Sower offers a map of California. This comes from Blaze. Do you know if there's a tour people can take, and what other ways can people interact with her work?
Wow. To my knowledge, I don't think there's a Parable of the Sower tour. However, Ayanna Jameson, who's the founder of the Octavia Butler Legacy Network, she periodically does do tours, not during COVID, of Octavia's Christina, and I have been on one of those, and those are wonderful. And Ayanna is part of my community that I met through being involved with Clock Shop and Radio Imagination. And she's just a lovely person. But yeah, she will take you around, and, you know, we did it. I've done it twice now, you know, with groups, you know, being in her spaces and walking, you know, in her, you know, footsteps. And I live in her neighborhood. So that's also, like, the big thing is, like, I've learned more about my neighborhood by doing that tour and being in the archive.
Last question. We're a little bit over. What's your next book? What are you working on next?
Oh gosh, this is always funny. David and I went through this when the interview. Like, my problem is I was working on something that I put away to do first after Image, and then to do Octavia, which I didn't think was going to be a book. I just thought it was going to be this. And I want to go back to that, which loosely has to do with creativity and chance and serendipity, which actually is in this book, is full of all of that. Her life was full of that. But I've also been looking in a different direction because because this always happens when you're working on something else pops up. So I'm just quiet about that because I don't know yet what that's gonna really be. So I'm writing now. I'm using COVID time to write to see where it goes.
All right. Well, please let us know when you're allowed to.
Promise.
Okay, thanks. With that, normally this is the time when I tell you to come back next week, but please don't come back next week. We will be when Alta Asks Alive will be on a winter hiatus, holiday hiatus until next month. On January 6th, we will be back. We will have the new issue of Alta, as well as guests around that starting in January, February, March. We're locking them in right now. People have been asking for a link to tomorrow night's California Book Club event with Walter Mosley, author of Devil in a Blue Dress. He will be joined by special guest Edwige Danticat, and he'll be in conversation with John Freeman. David Ulin will be doing introductions tomorrow night. So I'm going to send everyone an email with all of the info on this, as well as some of the things that Lynell mentioned in what was a fabulous, fabulous interview. So Lynell, thank you so much for your amazing work, including your amazing work for Alta. David, thank you. And everyone, especially, thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. Take care, happy holidays, and stay safe, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.